How do you like your tea? Cream? Sugar? Or do you want me to pee in it?
What? What did she say? Hello, folks. So, do you remember that time that Boris Johnson was accused of burning a £50 note in front of a homeless person? And he had to go on record to say that he'd never done that because it seemed like it might be something that he would do? I just feel like that tells you everything you need to know about everything. In 2020, Bong Joon-ho's 2019 black comedy thriller Parasite made history by becoming the first non-English language film to win the Academy Award for Best Picture. The film was a critical and commercial success, with the New York Times calling it wildly entertaining, the kind of smart, generous, aesthetically energised movie that obliterates the tired distinctions between art films and popcorn movies. And Vulture wrote that the film was a work that is itself a state of constant agitated transformation, a nerve-wracking masterpiece whose spell lingers long after its haunting final image. And it's not hard to see why. It's a brilliant movie, funny, tense, thrilling, exciting. There's a lot to like about Parasite. But for all its inventive directorial flair, filmmaking craft, smart writing, engaging performances, and strangely haunting humour, there's one thing about the film that, at least as far as I'm concerned, really struck a chord with audiences and critics alike. It's just so f***ing angry. As Variety's Jessica King put it, Bong is back on brilliant form, but he is unmistakably, roaringly furious, and it registers because the target is so deserving, so enormous, so 2019. Parasite is a tick fat with the bitter blood of class rage. That's right, folks, Parasite ain't no fan of the class divide, and it ain't alone. 2019 saw the release of a whole host of equally angry, somewhat class-conscious flicks, including Rian Johnson's murder mystery Knives Out, Radio Silence's cat and mouse horror Ready or Not, and Jordan Peele's home invasion spin Us. Hell, even the comic book movies decided to jump in on the action, with Todd Phillips' Scorsese riffing Joker trying its hand at some, social commentary.
Okay, I'm waiting for the punchline.
There is no punchline. It's not a joke.
That's about the nicest thing I'm going to say about that film, so moving swiftly on. But while I think it's safe to say that in 2019 there was certainly something in the air, the sad truth is class inequality is nothing new, and nor is Hollywood's desire to delve into it. From Charlie Chaplin's 1936 comedy Modern Times, through to John Carpenter's 1988 cult classic They Live, a seething hatred for class division and wealth inequality has always been present in cinema.
I have come here to chew bubblegum and kick ass. And I'm all out of bubblegum.
And this shouldn't really come as much of a surprise. The wealth gap has only worsened as time's worn on, and now we find ourselves in a world where, according to the World Inequality Report 2022, the poorest 50% of the world's population own just 2% of the total net worth, while the top 10% own 76%. With such gross unfairness, coupled with systemic issues that favour those with more over those with less, is it any surprise that the film industry finds itself tapping into such a topic? Of course not. But for all the cult classics and beloved entries into this peculiar little subgenre, there's one film that, in my opinion, stands above the rest. One that's just so bitterly angry, so aggressive in its takedown, and so wonderfully weird. Because you see, the problem doesn't just lay within the class divide. It lay somewhere far, far deeper. There's something very, very rotten with the world today, and it's systemic. It lays within systems and processes that are designed to keep the status quo as it is, to keep those on the bottom, and those at the top very much at the top. So, with all of that in mind, let's talk about Brian Yuzna's 1989 body horror Society. Society is an experience. When it was released in 1989, Brian Yuzna's Society was met with critical condemnation and poor reviews. Variety called it an extremely pretentious and obnoxious horror film, while the Austin Chronicle labelled it yet another in a long line of poorly produced horror paranoia bloodbaths, short on everything except cheesy effects. Of course, the horror genre has long suffered from critical bias. It's hardly a genre primed for awards. For every Get Out and its Best Screenplay Oscar, there are a dozen Toni Collette's in Hereditaries, overlooked performances, direction, writing, music, and so on. Horror just doesn't get much love from the folks with the awards. As Tim Faber pointed out in his article for the Financial Times, the exceptions that garnered awards and acclaim, The Shining, say, or Rosemary's Baby, were viewed as transcending rather than exemplifying the genre. And to a certain extent this is true. That's how horror movies are viewed. Faber claims that the modern rise in so-called elevated horror, such as Robert Eggers' The Witch or Jennifer Kent's The Babadook, comes as directors have opened up to provocative contemporary themes. But while so-called elevated horror has perhaps drawn far more acclaim than the genre has previously been afforded, this too is a pretty biased view. Faber's claims ignore the simple fact that the genre has always been used by filmmakers to explore society's social, political and economic concerns and fears. In fact, this is arguably horror's bread and butter. As a genre, it exists almost exclusively to prey upon provocative contemporary themes, from the Depression to Vietnam to 9/11 and the War on Terror. The horror genre is no stranger to real-world influences. Indeed, as film critic Robin Wood wrote, horror films are our collective nightmares. And just because a film may wear its more dramatic influences on its sleeve, doesn't somehow make it better than some of the less prestigious offerings that the genre has to offer. What's more though, is that while the art house tinged A24 produced award-winning drama-shaped horror may feel more accessible for audiences and more timely in terms of thematic concern, oftentimes it is horror's less mainstream, far more stranger, more gloopy offerings that have far more to say. Subtext is not necessarily better than text. That's right folks, not only can the trashy, schlocky, silly end of horror be just as concerned with provocative contemporary themes, more often than not, they're harsher, more blunt and more honest in their approach. I mean sure, Romero's Dawn of the Dead may be a brutal, gory, blood-soaked flick, filled with goofy violence and iconic practical effects, but are you really going to tell me that it isn't also a finely tuned takedown of capitalism and consumerism? Sounds like a provocative contemporary theme to me.
What the hell are they?
They're us, that's all. There's no more room in hell.
Horror has always been this way. A24 just marketed it better. I mean, ask Brian Yuzna.
And the review was terrible. It was just scathing.
Indeed, Yuzna's 1989 directorial debut Society illustrates Wood's point, utilising a fusion of melodrama and body horror drawn from Yuzna's own nightmares, to explore the political culture of the time and expose the unjust inequality beneath the surface. But more pertinently, for all its 80s cheese and over-the-top B-movie campiness, Yuzna's flick, in my opinion at least, manages to get to the crux of the point very few movies on similar topics ever do. The problem isn't just those at the top or those at the bottom, it's society as a whole, the very foundations of a system built on false notions of opportunity and freedom. The world we exist in is working against you. Paranoid? Sure, but just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not after you. So, we're going to talk about society, and we're going to do it without making a single "we live in a society" joke. Because we live in a society. Damn. Okay. I give myself 3, so that's 2 more. In 1989, the science fiction comedy Honey, I Shrunk the Kids was released into theatres. The film, starring comedy legend Rick Moranis as the quirky but lovable scientist and father Wayne Selinsky, was a box office success. Somewhat surprising Walt Disney Pictures, the studio behind it. And don't worry, this isn't going to turn into another Disney rant. I can avoid ranting about them just this one time. F*** Disney! The film would become the most successful live-action Disney film of all time, and launched the career of its first-time director, Joe Johnston, who would go on to helm such beloved 90s classics as The Rocketeer, The Page Master, well, the live-action sequences at least, and Jumanji.
Run! It's a stampede! The game!
As well as bringing an icon to the screen with 2011's Captain America: The First Avenger, making him one of the key players in the construction of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So, thanks, I guess? Moreover, the flick itself spawned something of a franchise with 2 sequels, 1991's Honey, I Blew Up the Kid, and 1997's Honey, We Shrunk Ourselves, as well as a TV show based on the film that ran from 1997 to 2000.
Destroy.
And a sort of reboot requel titled Simply Shrunk. Apparently. I don't know. Is this even happening anymore? Still, all in all, not too shabby for a film that was inspired by cult 50s B-movies like The Incredible Shrinking Man, and began life as the brainchild of the folks behind grisly and gory Lovecraft adaptations Reanimator and From Beyond. Yep, that's right folks. One of the most interesting facets of Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, in my opinion at least, is that the original story and screenplay came from shock and horror masters Stuart Gordon and Brian Yuzna.
Interesting.
I've always considered it to be one of those weird connections that once you stop and sort of breathe in the strangeness of it all, actually kind of makes sense. I mean, of course Yuzna and Gordon would write something like this. Have you seen Reanimator? Moranis' Selinsky and Jeffrey Combs' Herbert West even look the same. Now that's a crossover I want to see. Make it happen.
You're better off without her.
Come on Disney, you can do it. And hey, if you don't like it, you can just delete it from your platform. I mean, that's how you treat the rest of the movies under your belt these days, isn't it? You goddamn mousy sons of bitch! But while Honey, I Shrunk the Kids will undoubtedly be Gordon and Yuzna's most well-known and mainstream work, it is perhaps not what they personally are best remembered for. No, what the duo tend to be most fondly remembered for is their works within the horror genre. And, in Yuzna's case specifically, weird and nightmarishly twisted body horror of the kind not seen elsewhere. But where did all this begin? And how did Brian Yuzna go from being a talented and skilled producer to one of the most grossly underappreciated horror filmmakers of all time? Well, the story begins in 1922, when celebrated horror author H.P. Lovecraft released his serialized story, Herbert West Reanimator. Well, not really, but Yuzna's desire to become a producer was born first from his love of cinema, but while he decided to create movies, as the man himself puts it.
When I began, honestly, I didn't really know what the different jobs were. Somebody told me that the producer was the boss, he made the most money, so I thought, okay, I'll be the producer.
And he had observed that rather than the director being the head honcho, as so often appears to be the case, it is in fact the producer who calls the shots. So he set to work producing, and his first released work as producer was the now iconic 1985 cult classic, Reanimator.
You killed him. No, I did not. I gave him life.
The film was born from writer-director Stuart Gordon's desire to see more Frankenstein-esque properties released, and having met the soon-to-be director while shopping the flick around, Gordon found that Yuzna quickly proved himself a capable and active producer when he landed the film a distribution deal with Charles Band's Empire Pictures. And Reanimator was actually pretty well received upon release. It was a relative hit and earned lots of critical praise. While talking with horror movie magazine Fangoria, Yuzna described the film as having the sort of shock sensibilities of an Evil Dead with the production values of, hopefully, The Howling. And that's a pretty good summation as far as I'm concerned. Reanimator is awesome, and it set a precedent, not just for the duo's work together, but for Yuzna's career as a solo artist going forward. Even the New York Times were taken with it, writing, "Reanimator has a fast pace and a good deal of grisly vitality. It even has a sense of humour, albeit one that would be lost on 99.9% of any ordinary movie-going crowd." And given the film's success, it wasn't long before Yuzna was able to secure funding for his next project. Another Lovecraft adaptation, 1986's From Beyond, saw Yuzna re-team with director Gordon and many of the cast and crew of their previous film. As Gordon saw it, the initial plan was to produce a series of Lovecraft adaptations featuring the same actors in a similar vein to Roger Corman's Edgar Allan Poe movies. while Yuzna saw the potential in such a thing from a commercial standpoint, and so it was this idea that drove the decision making. However, From Beyond also saw the producer take on a more active role within the creative process. He even gets a story by credit. Much like its predecessor, the film was well received by critics and did well against its budget, leading to Charles Band greenlighting a third feature from Yuzna and Gordon, this one based on an original script by writer Ed Naha, 1987's Dolls. And Dolls is weird. It's fun, but it's nowhere near as good as Reanimator or From Beyond. It lacks that Lovecraft, Yuzna, Gordon charm. Love Yuzden. Dolls would be the last film both Gordon and Yuzna would work on before Honey, I Shrunk the Kids came along. Now there's some speculation on my part here, but I expect the experience of working with Disney left Yuzna somewhat frustrated. And who can blame him? They're Disney.
Oh, that does it!
I don't know why Disney keep coming up, but they do, and so I'm going to have a go at them. Anyway, I suspect that Yuzna had come to producing in the hopes of being head honcho, but during this period of his career watched as Gordon got the praise for their flicks, and then had Honey, I Shrunk the Kids picked up by the corporate machine that is Disney, no doubt forcing him to relinquish a level of control. Having made the move to child-friendly material in an effort to produce something that his children could watch, after Honey, I Shrunk the Kids was finished with, Yuzna turned his attention back to horror, and this time set about positioning himself in the director's chair in order to ensure that he got the recognition that he felt he deserved. In order to achieve this goal, Yuzna used his producer's savvy and used his attachment to Reanimator as a bargaining chip, which, as it turns out, was a smart move. But before we talk about Yuzna's directorial debut, I want to take a look quickly at his style and the recurrent themes that run throughout the early period of his time in the director's chair. Yuzna has a style and a way of shooting that is undeniably his own. In a nutshell, there's nothing else quite like a Brian Yuzna joint. His films are somehow simultaneously darkly hilarious and uncomfortably unsettling, with the camera capturing a quality that's as deeply off-putting and disorientating as it is oddly campy and kind of silly. What's more, all of this feels undeniably deliberate on the filmmaker's part, and each and every one of the movies that appear in his filmography all seem to be of a piece with each other. And while the notion of auteurism might seem slightly silly in schlocky B-movie horror, if such a thing does exist, then, in my opinion, Yuzna is one of the most interesting examples of it. Which begs the question, what do we call this style? Yuznarian? Yuzner-esque? Yuznian? Yuznian, yeah, I like that. His films often feature gloopy practical effects and a sense of heightened unrealness that works to create campy, offbeat original tones. But beyond the aesthetic, there's a thematic connection that runs through most of the filmmaker's early output. Yuzna's flicks have a preconception with false realities. His central characters tend to struggle to know what's real and what is not, and this is heightened by the filmmaker's unusual and quirky style. Whether it's the deranged fantasies of Corbin Bernsen's titular doctor in 1996's The Dentist, or the strange goings-on experienced by Neath Hunter's Kim Levitt in his 1990 sort of sequel, Silent Night, Deadly Night 4 Initiation. The key connective tissue that runs throughout Yuzna's early output as director is this twisted sense of fantasy and reality. Well, that and groupy practical effects driven body horror, but we'll get to that, don't worry. All of these themes are present and correct in his debut feature as director, 1989's Society. And Society is a wild ride. As far as feature debuts go, it's quite a statement. And if you haven't seen it, I really do urge you to track down a copy because, well, you don't want it to be spoiled. And I say that as someone who doesn't really care about spoilers. Trust me, Society must be seen to be believed.
Let me give you a hand, Bill.
So, now that we have a bit of an understanding of the man himself, let's take a look at how Society came to be and what the it even is anyway. So, Yuzna's leveraging of the proposed Reanimator sequel was a deliberate decision on the director's part.
So in case my first one was an unmitigated disaster, I would always get that second chance, because I noticed that most directors, as a French distributor friend of mine once told me, make 2 movies with their first movie, their first and their last.
And Yuzna already knew what his first feature would be. Having spent several years working with Dan O'Bannon, the man behind the screenplay for Alien and the director of the excellent Return of the Living Dead, the duo had crafted a story for a flick entitled The Men. Not that mediocre Alex Garland flick from a couple of years ago. A different, much better sounding film.
No. Mustn't do that. Forbidden fruit.
The Men told the story of, as Yuzna himself puts it,
This world in which a woman discovers that all men are aliens.
and it was the paranoid melding of fantasy and reality that drew the filmmaker in. However, when O'Bannon eventually departed the project, Yuzna was left unfulfilled. As luck would have it, a new script would fall into his lap, this one written by Woody Keith and Rick Fly, which he was drawn to thanks to the similarities with the Men. The initial concept for Society was something far closer to your more generic slasher. Yuzna altered the script dramatically, removing some of the more generic slasher-esque elements and drastically changing the finale, which in the original version involved a satanic cult and lots of bloody murder. With the deal in place, Yuzna set about making sure that his directorial debut would be as pure a realisation of his creative vision as the budget would allow. The resulting movie is 1989's Society, which is, in my opinion, one of the single greatest movies ever made. No joke. Like, seriously. And I'm not entirely sure what that says about me, but it might explain why I'm still single. Yeah, that and the really annoying bit of hair sticking out of your head. Of course, what's so memorable about Society is its ending, which remains one of the most shocking, gruesome and creatively weird finales in film history. One of the things that makes the flick so interesting, at least in terms of Yuzna's career, is the way in which Society showcases his interests, dealing with imagery, ideas, themes and styles that the filmmaker would continue to explore throughout his career in the director's chair. It's as if Yuzna arrived on the directorial scene fully formed and ready with his own unique style. The nightmarish visuals, canted angles, griminess, emphasis on grotesque set pieces, goofy humour, and disturbing and taboo subject matter viewed through a peculiarly thoughtful and interesting lens, often dealing with ideas far beyond the kind one expects from B-movie silliness like this, are all things that he would return to time and time again. And moreover, it's clear that Yuzna has some issues with Society in general, especially a society that's dark underbelly is hidden beneath a glossy surface, one that presents itself as one thing but is actually another. Here in Society, this is made flesh, but through the film's tackling of class in America, and its presentation of the upper class in Beverly Hills as monstrous creatures who, well, shunt. We'll get there, don't worry. Society tells the story of high school student Bill Whitney, as portrayed by daytime soap actor Billy Warlock, who lives with his wealthy parents and sister in a mansion in Beverly Hills, California. Bill is suffering from what appears to be a state of paranoia, and does not trust his high society family. He feels somehow different from them, although he is not entirely sure why.
We're just one big happy family, except for a little incest and psychosis.
And as the narrative progresses, Bill begins to lose his grip on reality, experiencing surreal visions of bodies contorted in impossible ways, strange noises in the night, and an uncomfortable intimate relationship between his parents and his sister. And the more acute his paranoia becomes, the more he begins to question the cultural hegemony of the society in which he lives. Soon, Bill discovers that there is more to his misgivings than previously thought, as he uncovers a conspiracy. Okay, I'm going to jump in here quickly and just say that things are about to get weird. And if you've not seen Society, I really strongly recommend that you go and watch Society before continuing on with this video, because there are things here that once you've seen them, you can't unsee, and I'd hate to be the one that spoils it for you. Bill learns that, far from simply being paranoid, his fears barely scratch the surface, as we discover along with him that the ruling class aren't simply bastards with a lack of empathy, but are, in fact, an entirely different species. One that literally feeds on what they perceive as the lower class, which would, explain a lot about the Tory party. I can't say that, can I? As Robin Wood said, cannibalism represents the ultimate in possessiveness, hence the logical end of human relations under capitalism. And discussing society is difficult.
It's terrible. Just terrible.
Oh my, it's just awful.
While writing this, I found myself repeating the phrase, don't spoil the ending, don't spoil the ending. Because, like, seriously, don't spoil the ending. Yuzna's society is just something else entirely. It really does need to be seen to be believed. And no amount of praise, and trust me, I'm about to heap a whole lot of praise on it, can really do it justice. Even I myself can't quite believe that Yuzna managed to get away with this, and I first saw it like, I don't know, 20 years ago? It's a bizarre, surreal, outrageous and ballsy little movie that, in my opinion at least, gives meaning to the oft-overused phrase underappreciated, and absolutely deserves way more love than it currently gets. In their review for the picture, Empire magazine called it the anti-Ferris Bueller, and it's hard to argue with that.
Oh, wow, that's pretty impressive, man.
You bitch. Oh, you son of a bitch. Come on.
It would be easy to say that it exists within the category of too ahead of its time, given its troubling relevance today, except that it was just as relevant upon release. And it's also so hilarious in the 80s that to claim such is just ridiculous.
You're just using your athletic ability to get the votes of the childish morons in this audience. Looks to me like you just lost a moron vote, Marty.
But then, it really is relevant today. And, folks, that just f***ing sucks. Society was, at the time, disappointingly, a bust. To point out the Marxist undertones, or overtones, perhaps, the film really isn't subtle. It's obvious, but what makes Society so good is the way that Yuzna develops these themes and these ideas. It works as a subversion of the glitz and gloss of other media of the time. Reagan's America. Oh, we're going to do politics. And don't worry, there's going to be a lot more politics later. Won't that be fun? Reagan's America was one that believed, as Gordon Gekko so beautifully put it,
greed, for lack of a better word, is good.
And that mantra seeped its way into much of the mainstream output of the era. From Dynasty to Scarface, the decade indulged in the spoils of wealth, celebrating the outlandish behaviours and extravagant spending of the rich and well-to-do. And aren't we lucky we grew out of that? Seriously, if these guys have got time to arrange stupid little bullshit cage matches between each other, they've got time to, like, save the world. And Yuzna smartly draws upon the styles and aesthetics of these properties to build his world. A world that he will then peel back to reveal the darkness underneath. And the practical effects by special makeup artist Screaming Mad George really are a sight to behold. And yes, that is his name, I didn't make that up. Society is also a hilariously good time, with plenty of odd little throwaway gags and lines of dialogue. And it has one of the best final lines of any film. Apparently back in 2013 there was even talk of a potential sequel, Society 2, Body Modification. Personally though, I think I'd like to see the concept brought more up to date with a Blumhouse style requel. I mean, the film certainly leaves itself open for such, and it'd be interesting to see what modern audiences would make of this kind of weird, gloopy, sexualised trash. We really need sex back in cinema. Perhaps the only word that can really do Society justice is unique. There is quite literally nothing else like it. A strange blend of comedy and horror that is equal parts funny, creepy, outrageous and gross. I just adore Society. And, you know guys, we live in a society. Uh-oh, we're going to have to talk about Karl Marx. Shall I wear riot gear?
Don't you think that sounds a little bit paranoid? No. No, I've never been paranoid.
You all know who Marx is, right? I don't need to do like a Marx rundown in order to bring us all up to speed, do I? Do I? Alright, fine. Karl Marx was a German-born philosopher, economist, sociologist, political theorist and journalist. He's best known for his work analysing and critiquing capitalism, most notably in the 1848 pamphlet the Communist Manifesto, and the 3-part volume Capital. He was the founder of Marxism, a political theory that, despite what crazed YouTube man babies and cigarette-swilling, beer-smoking politicians may tell you... Wait. Never mind. Despite what its detractors may tell you, Marxism is not a wild, world-ending conspiracy theory. Rather, it is a style of socio-economic analysis that draws on materialist interpretations of a society and its historical development to build a better understanding of class and social conflicts within said society. In a nutshell. I mean, there's more. Much more. But f*** it, I'm a movie buff, not a flippin' political theory understander person. That is the official term. For our purposes, we'll be drawing upon the works of Marx and his fellow philosopher and historian Friedrich Engels to better understand the thematic concerns of the film's society, and we'll also be looking at how the film uses cinematic tropes and styles to build upon and explore these themes. Essentially, we'll be using the works of Marx and Engels to analyse both society and what it has to say about... society. That's confusing. To put it another way, we'll be analysing the film through the lens of Marxism to better understand what its narrative, themes and ideas convey about our world. This approach is sometimes known as Marxist film theory. And since it's quite literally Marxism meeting culture, I guess you can go ahead and call this video Cultural Marxism. I also learned this at university, and I guess you could say I was indoctrinated. Yes, I'm a loony lefty, feel free to turn off now. No, wait, please stay, I have much more to say. Okay, thank you. Free healthcare for all! Okay, so now we have a bit of an understanding about who Marx is, let's talk about society. In Capital, Marx writes, "Capital is dead labour that, vampire-like, only lives by sucking living labour." This metaphor is taken to the extreme in society, where the elite must feed upon members of the lower class, while simultaneously forcing the lower class into a state of dependence on them. Marx and Engels saw the upper and lower classes as two great hostile camps, directly facing each other. They state that the ruling class, or the bourgeoisie, exploit the working class, or the proletariat, to maintain their power, having seized the means of production from the workers and forced the world into a state of universal interdependence. Which, yeah, they have. Championed by the likes of former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and former American President Ronald Reagan. This is basically what drives the concept of trickle-down economics, the idea that poor people experience positive effects when rich people get richer and spend more money. Which, as American economist Thomas Sowell wrote, is a concept that cannot be found even in the most voluminous scholarly studies of economic theories. In recent years, we've seen a resurgence of this political ideology, from the ideals of the Trump White House to the austerity-driven policies of the Conservative Party here in the UK, policies that have reportedly driven to an increase in wealth inequality, placed thousands of people into poverty, and even led to death. Do you enjoy being lied to? Do you wish your friends and neighbours were worse off? Do you like seeing people line up for food banks, the NHS struggle to treat patients, and want to watch the world burn? Well, boy, have we got the perfect opportunity for you. Vote Conservative, because one day you too might be rich enough to benefit.
Is everybody ready for the big sun of the night?
But in society, the bourgeoisie is a separate species that control the rest of society through power, money and influence. I mean, it's not an especially deep or complex metaphor. The film doesn't give a damn about subtlety.
What's going on? Didn't you know, Billy Boy? The rich have always sucked off low-class like you.
Oh, I love it. As Engels put it, the bourgeoisie turn the power of government against the proletariat. And in society, we see the ruling class discussing their influence in Washington, we see them rigging the student council elections, and we even see that they have control of the police and hospitals. And it's in part through this that they isolate Bill. He is unable to seek help or fully investigate his suspicions without the ruling class interfering. His only source of support comes from his therapist, who is, unbeknownst to him, also a member of the elite. As Marx wrote, An immediate consequence of the fact that man is estranged from his life activity, from his species being, is the estrangement of man from man. The more Bill comes to recognise the true nature of the ruling class, the more he becomes disillusioned and estranged not only from his own family and friends, but from himself and everything around him. He questions his relationship with his girlfriend Shauna, and with his friend Milo, while they both seem to show little interest in anything beyond childish concerns like what party they'll be attending or who is dating who. Bill, meanwhile, has no interest in such things. In turn, he worries that the fault is somehow with him, a fear fueled by his therapist.
Now, some people make the rules and some people follow the rules. It's a question of what you're born to.
And you kind of got to wonder how much this guy's charging for these sessions. In society, the ruling class present themselves as friendly, polite, and upstanding members of their community. Their outer image is almost sickly sweet. Bill's parents and sister are forever hugging, embracing, and kissing each other. They are constantly complimenting one another, presenting a respectable exterior. Engels wrote of the bourgeoisie that they appear in ordinary intercourse as decent and respectable. But beneath this, no other class was so incurably debased by selfishness, so corroded within. And society takes the concept of a grim reality hidden beneath a respectable exterior to the extreme. Later in the film, when Bill is given a cassette tape by his sister's suspicious ex-boyfriend, Tim Bartels Blanchard, upon listening to it he hears what appears to be depraved sexual orgies involving his sister and both his parents, as well as many of their high society associates. Bill cannot trust anyone. He is trapped, manipulated and abused. Bill is, unknowingly, taunted by the upper class. His therapist tells him,
"You're going to make a wonderful contribution to society."
A phrase that takes on a far more menacing and insidious meaning come the film's climax. But we'll get to that. Ben Meyerson's upper-class teen Ted Ferguson has Bill thrown into a swimming pool while attending a party, humiliating and asserting dominance over him. Meanwhile, Bill's family continually reminds him of his otherness. Engels wrote that the bourgeoisie is utterly indifferent to whether his working men starve or not, if only he makes money. And in society, the ruling class is indifferent to Bill.
I do love the smell of the hunt and the taste of the shunt.
They don't care for him beyond their eventual feasting upon him. They have no interest in his extracurricular activities. When Bill has a basketball game, they ignore it entirely. And even as Bill attempts to make general conversation with them, they shun him in praise of their daughter instead, keeping eye contact with her even when talking to Bill. Which becomes even creepier as the film progresses. Like, seriously. You don't know. Oh God! They refuse to speak about his friends or his interests. When Bill plans to head out to the beach for the day with his girlfriend, he attempts to tell his parents where he's going, but they abruptly cut the conversation short mid-sentence before turning away from him entirely. And it all serves to separate Bill from them. He is not, nor can he ever be, truly a part of their society. Even when he's invited in, he remains entirely outside. As Engels notes, for the bourgeoisie, nothing exists in this world except for the sake of money. And indeed, it is only when Bill receives a telegram inviting him to an otherwise exclusive party held by Ferguson, the wealthy student at his high school, does his family show any sign of interest in Bill's social activities. Even then, however, their interest is entirely outside of Bill's relation to it. Having learned suddenly of Blanchard's death, Bill rushes home to tell his parents and his sister, who had dated Blanchard for a short while before the events of the film. His parents and his sister sit behind an extravagant gold-coated table, while Bill stands in front of them, almost as though he were being sentenced or interrogated. While Bill desperately tries to discuss with them the death of Blanchard, whom he fears may have been murdered, they instead gush over how expensive the house the party will be held at. Bill is simply just not a part of their class, and that's despite the fact that he lives in the same house and considers these people his family. Marx and Engels wrote of the proletariat that he is without property. His relation to his wife and children has no longer anything in common with the bourgeoisie family relation. Bill has no job, no home of his own, and no money. His friends and his position are dictated to him via the social standing of his family. They are his parents, his therapist, his peers. They provide for him, house him, clothe him and feed him. He is isolated from members of his own species. To the elite, Bill is little more than livestock, and like livestock, he relies on them for his own survival, unaware of his impending doom. When the ruling class finally do reveal themselves, they refer to Bill as
that special treat we've been hearing so much about. A wonderful specimen, in his prime.
We're never told where Bill comes from or who his biological parents are, only that he has been
nurtured by Jim and Nan in their very own home.
He's a blank canvas upon which the whole of the proletariat could be projected, seen by the ruling class as little more than a commodity, and thus sinks to the level of a commodity. It's grim. Bill's isolation is further emphasised through the film's mise-en-scène. While the elite dresses well, blazers, shirts, dresses, jewellery, Bill dresses predominantly in casual wear. As I already said, he's often separated from them physically as well. Whether it be a desk that separates him from his therapist, a table between him and his parents, or even the misted glass door of a shower. Oh my god, it's gross. It's so gross. So too is he separated from them physically. When he speaks to his parents, they are often seen coupled together, holding hands or with their arms around each other, while he is left to stand away from them, isolated. An early scene in the film sees them stand on the stairs with his sister, while Bill remains at the bottom, looking up at the family above him. And then there's the ending, which, well, look, it's wild, and we will get there, trust me, but, yeah. Society is one of the very few films that I can honestly think of that is really wholly unique. But while all of this is interesting and undoubtedly key to what the flick is trying to say, for me the more interesting facet of Society lay in how it presents all of this. How it comments on the styles and aesthetics of the movies and television around it to make its point. But this is a double-edged sword, one that leaves the film as both a clear example of schlocky, cheesy, pastel-coloured 80s trash, and also a scathing deconstruction of that. So, throughout the film, Yuzna puts us very much within Bill's perspective of the world. The camera often frames Bill alone. He shares the shot with no one. He's often centred, and even when speaking with people, stands isolated and separated from them. Other characters, meanwhile, are often framed in groups, the blocking placing Bill away from them, and them with one another. When Bill speaks with his parents, they are linked together, holding hands or draping their arms over each other. When he confronts school bully Ferguson at the party, Ferguson is surrounded by his friends and peers, while Bill remains alone. As we've already suggested, this literally isolates him, not just within the frame, but within the world and within the mind of the audience. The film opens with a POV shot from Bill's perspective as he investigates the strange noises in his house. The use of the POV serves not only to align the audience with Bill, but also to create a sense of unease from the very beginning. Other than a single establishing shot, the very first thing we're privy to is Bill's point of view as he enters the large, extravagant Beverly Hills house he calls home. And even here he's placed as an outsider. The film literally begins with him entering the wealthy lair of the villain, and bringing us along with him. And Yuzna then pulls the trick we'll spend the remainder of the film expanding upon. This creepy, nightmarish horror movie is revealed to be, well, an actual nightmare. It's not real. The whole of the opening of the film is revealed to be nothing more than a dream, and this tells us immediately that we can't trust what we see. Falseness and fakeness is everywhere. When the film begins, Bill is already beginning to question things around him, and beginning the film in this way means that we are too. The Beverly Hills mansion in which Bill and his family live is at first presented as a dark and shadowy space filled with creaking floorboards and peculiar sounds. It is only after this that we then see it as a bright and lavish upper-class home. As a result, we, like Bill, are already positioned to be suspicious of what we're seeing. The true darkness underneath, glimpsed within the film's opening, and then withheld, hidden away behind the glossy sheen. And Yuzna's crafting of this overtly artificial world extends beyond the visual techniques he employs and into the casting as well. Billy Warlock was, at the time, well known for his role as Frankie Brady on the hugely popular daytime soap Days of Our Lives. In the year of Society's release, Warlock would also appear in Baywatch, another popular American drama that draws heavily on melodrama in its stylistic approach.
Shawnee, look, I said I was sorry and I meant it. But I'm really not in the mood to talk about your boyfriend. See you tomorrow, okay?
And Warlock isn't the only cast member with daytime soap connections either. Evan Richards, who plays Milo in the film, was another recognisable daytime soap actor, having taken recurring roles in several well-known American soap operas, while both Ben Slack and Connie Denise had both appeared in the likes of Murder, She Wrote and Columbo. Admittedly not daytime soap operas or melodramas, but still very much TV shows that embrace that kind of artificial televisual style. Devin De Vasquez, who plays Clarissa in the film and was a former Playboy Playmate, would later go on to appear in several made-for-television movies, a genre that also traditionally draws upon the stylistic aesthetics of melodrama. And while part of this will undoubtedly be budgetary restrictions and an attempt to draw on a certain level of brand recognition, I find it hard to believe that it's not also integral on Yuzna's part to purposefully place the audience in the mindset of these kinds of stories. The metatextual elements of Society, in part at least, serve to draw our attention to the melodramatic and soap opera-esque elements of it. Basically, it reminds us all that this is fake. In their paper, Opening America, the telenovelarization of US soap operas, B&B and Harriton state that the medium of soap operas relies on elements of melodrama as a stylistic form. Society uses melodrama and the aesthetics of American daytime soaps to further heighten the paranoia Bill, and by extension the audience, feel of the world around them. As Mary Ellen Brown writes in her article, soap operas practice a stylistic excess and defy realism. And as outlined, Society is also stylistically excessive and defies realism. And this is key to the Marxist aspects of the film. In fact, it's arguably the most important part. Marx wrote that, in order to oppress a class, certain conditions must be assured to it under which it can, at least, continue its slavish existence. This false world, with its touches of melodrama and soap opera aesthetics, are the conditions under which Bill can continue his own slavish existence. And it should come as no surprise then that the acting in the flick is equally as over the top and self-aware. It evokes the Brechtian distancing effect, a technique designed to draw attention to itself in a way as to exaggerate the falseness and force the audience to become a conscious critical observer. Bill's parents and sister are constantly forcing smiles at him. Their movements are stiff, their dialogue stunted and awkward. Everything is presented as being so exaggerated that it stretches beyond the realms of believability and into the uncanny. And I want to pause here for a moment and talk about Douglas Sirk. Douglas Sirk was a German-born filmmaker who... No, wait, that's wrong. That's the Marx thing. Hold on. Douglas Sirk was a German-born filmmaker who, after leaving Germany due to political differences and for the safety of his Jewish wife in 1937. Good for you, Dougie! Started working in Hollywood, directing anti-Nazi propaganda flicks like 1943's Hitler's Madman, while under contract at Columbia Pictures. After briefly returning to Germany post-war, Sirk secured his position in the annals of cinema history by directing a series of colourful melodramas for Universal, including 1955's All That Heaven Allows and 1956's Written on the Wind, both of which starred Rock Hudson. They're fun. Honestly, it depends on how much tolerance you have for melodrama. And I have a lot, you bastards. I love melodrama. Why won't you just let me have this? Just let me have it! Ah! At the time of their release, Sirk's films were dismissed as simply being women's pictures. Films that dealt with so-called feminine concerns like domestic life, romance, and parenthood. So all good things. However, since then, his films have received something of a reappraisal. Sirk's films are noticeable primarily for the way in which the director places emotion above narrative, logic and realism, and was known to evoke Brechtian acting styles, borrowing from his time as a theatre director.
Are you finding what you really want? I'm somebody else. I'm white. White. White!
Oh god, it's so dramatic! Doing so to exaggerate the conventions of melodrama. sometimes garishly, often bordering on kitsch, and thereby also expose the self-deceit and fantasy inherent in the world of the movie. If you've never seen a Douglas Sirk flick, I suggest sitting down with 1959's Imitation of Life, which is, in my opinion at least, the director at his most melodramatic. And it's also fabulous! This self-deceit exists for Bill, who believes he himself is a member of the ruling class. The truth is that the Beverly Hills elite have crafted his existence around him for the sole purpose of keeping him in his place until they wish to feed on him. Engels wrote, "If here the workers are not educated, i.e. to the obedience of the bourgeoisie, they may even be capable of viewing their greatest benefactors, the bourgeoisie, with jealous and hostile eyes." Bill is kept in line, under the rule of the cultural hegemony, but as his awareness of the faux nature of it begins to increase, so too does he begin to turn against those who have placed him there. We could learn a lot from Bill. Revolution? Film theorist Laura Mulvey states that melodrama draws its source material from unease and contradiction within the very icon of American life, the home. And using Mulvey's observations, one doesn't need to look hard to find the melodramatic elements of society. The driving force of Bill's paranoia and uncertainty is his family and his home. His home is situated in the pure American city of Beverly Hills, California, the symbolic destination point of the American dream. But Bill's family's continually peculiar behaviour creates a sense of unease both for Bill and the audience, especially given the grotesquely incestuous undertones, which quickly seep through the surface and are just disgusting. Blah! Peeling back the superficial idyllic sheen of society to reveal the twisted darkness underneath is one of the film's primary concerns, as is made overtly clear in the opening sequence when Bill, while attending a session with his therapist, bites into a luscious-looking green apple, only to discover the inside is rotted, stuffed full of wriggling, writhing maggots and worms. Subtlety be damned! This focus on the sinister underbelly fits perfectly with Mulvey's observations on melodrama, but so too does it align itself with Robin Wood's writings on the horror genre, particularly in Wood's essay Return of the Repressed, where he states while discussing recurring motifs within the genre that horror characteristically emphasises the sweetness and light of the home, but that beneath this ostensibly happy, somewhat complacent surface, the terrible forces prepare themselves. Terrible forces prepare themselves in society, and the rotting core of an apple is only the beginning. Early in the film, Bill's sister asks him to zip up the back of her dress, and as he does, the skin on her back pulsates as if something were inside, trying to force its way out. It's creepy. Anyway, Bill is horrified, and when he goes to look again, there's nothing there. Later, when Bill attempts to tell his parents he's going to the beach, they're stood in the garden admiring what appears to be the flowers, only for it to be revealed that they are in fact admiring the slugs. There are things in this film that seem so outlandish and bizarre, and yet simultaneously they're all things I can imagine Jacob Rees-Mogg doing.
Well, as many of you know, I'm very keen on nannies. I think they're the backbone of Britain, and they've done so much to keep the nation on the straight and narrow over the decades and centuries, but I'm not keen on the nanny state.
Yeah. Moreover, the colour palette of both the sets and costumes is intense, bright and obtrusive. The lighting is almost garish throughout, well lit with an artificial television set sheen, and the camera is continuously placed in unusual places, utilising a deep focus and an excessive use of close-ups to draw attention to the expressivity of the performances. And these aspects, among others, are also recognisably Sirkian. Throughout his filmography, Sirk drew on a whole host of techniques to capture and portray emotion, and we see a lot of it crop up throughout society. As Robert Pippin writes, the garishness of Sirk's presentation of such worlds always appears to suggest that this world, a clearly artificial world, no natural colours look like the ones we see, the world presented as if it were a bright ad in a slick magazine or a television show in early colour, is some sort of projection of the character's own sense of themselves. Bill's position, as it appears initially, is one of privilege. He believes himself to be a member of the high society. But, as Engels wrote, ideology is a process accomplished by the so-called thinker consciously. It is true, but with a false consciousness. The real motive forces impelling him remain unknown to him, otherwise it simply would not be an ideological process. Thus, while Bill may exist within the high society Beverly Hills environment, as already outlined, he is entirely separate from it. He is told in the film's climactic moments,
Jesus, Bill, you never were one of us.
His inability to fit in is something that exacerbates his self-doubt. He fears that perhaps it is not the world that is false, but rather his perception of it. According to Thomas Alcester, an important aspect of cinematic melodrama is the metaphorical interpretation of class conflict as sexual exploitation and the class conflict is clear, and the overtly sexual nature of the upper classes within society certainly does highlight this. Throughout the film, sex is presented as horrific or inhuman, with bodies moulding together, distorting themselves, and excreting slime, pleasurable only for the upper class. And again, then there's the ending, which we'll get to, and I'm also trying really hard to work around because, YouTube. In her acclaimed analysis of the genre Men, Women and Chainsaws, Carol J. Clover writes that sexual transgressors are scheduled for early destruction, but society subverts this trend. Here the sexual transgressors are the destructors. Throughout the film, the ruling class use sex as a means of oppressing or controlling the otherwise sexless Bill. Bill has seemingly little to no interest in sex with his girlfriend Shauna. The closest the couple get to a romantic moment is when she asks him to rub in the suntan lotion while on the beach, a task Bill fails to carry out when he's distracted by Clarissa. And she then sprays him with the suntan lotion, like this.
Don't get too hot.
Take from that what you will. In Clarissa, Bill finds something of a sexual awakening. He is drawn to her in the way that he is drawn to no other character. He literally lusts after her, and at first she uses this against him. When Ferguson and Clarissa sense that Bill is gaining support while giving a speech to the student body during the student council elections, Clarissa opens her legs seductively and catches Bill's gaze, causing him to trail off and accidentally agree with an unpopular position, which understandably pisses Shauna off. I mean, Bill, hun, have some self-control. Later still, when Clarissa takes Bill back to her house after he is thrown into the pool at the party, it is she who seduces him into making love, in an effort to draw Bill away from his continued attempts at discovering the truth about what has happened to Blanchard. As Robin Wood wrote, social revolution and sexual revolution are inseparably linked and necessary to each other. And I say the revolution can't come soon enough. I'm single and ready to mingle. Indeed, Bill's relationship with Clarissa serves to lead him to fight back against the ruling class. Her information and support enables Bill to finally become freed from the false consciousness of the ruling class, but so too does Clarissa's relationship with Bill lead to her own disillusion. Ultimately, she not only helps Bill to escape, but also joins him as she does, and as such she becomes that section of the ruling class that cuts itself adrift and joins the revolutionary class, the class that holds up the future in its hands. Which I think is how Keir Starmer sees himself, but he's no Playboy playmate. At least, I don't think so. Now there's an image absolutely none of us needed. So anyway, let's talk about the shunt. Alright folks, here we are. We can avoid it no longer. We gotta talk about the ending. How do I put this? Could you imagine if, Deliverance met The Thing, but it was directed by David Cronenberg? Kinda like that. Yuzna conjured up the imagery in part due to his own nightmares.
And I had all these nightmares about people's bodies touching and melding together, and it was...
The sequence is horrifically frightening as it is grotesquely captivating, and there's nothing I can say that will really convey its power. It's frustrating to try and talk around it here, so I'm going to try and do my best to discuss it while also remaining within the boundaries of YouTube. After revealing themselves to Bill, the ruling class bring up their first victim, Blanchard, who, Bill discovers, is now not dead. Around the neck of both Bill and Blanchard are catch poles of the kind one might expect to see used to catch stray dogs. conjuring up images of pure breeding and casting Bill and Blanchard as the dirty mongrels in need of putting down. And then, the upper class members of society begin to engage in what at first appears to be an orgy of some kind. But it soon becomes apparent that this isn't the fun kind of orgy. This is something else. As they touch each other, their skin begins to meld together, creating one singular entity made up of twisted flesh and body parts. Blanchard is violently forced to the floor and the upper class pounce on him, tearing off his clothes and erotically rubbing themselves over his body, laughing and groaning with pleasure, while Blanchard screams in terror. And this is the point where when I show people society for the first time, I know whether our friendship is going to last. Most people just leave me, but, you know, I think that says more about them than it does me. In this moment, the lighting changes from the artificial televisual style we've seen throughout the rest of the flick, as red and orange filters are applied, and the soundtrack is overtaken by a haunting and peculiar version of the Eton boating song. Boris Johnson would be so proud.
But blah, blah, blah.
Blah, 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 f*** you. In a wide shot, we see the horror unfolding, framed almost as if it were a work of art. The juxtaposition between the horror on screen and the upper-class elitist connotations of the music, along with the picturesque way in which the sequence is framed, only furthers the unease of the sequence. It's as if the film finally allows the sheen and glossy artifice of the surface to fizzle away and reveal all those wriggly worms in the core of the apple. And then... Well... They do something that they call a shunt.
And now, we'll get to the bottom.
Oh, God.
Of this.
Yep. The metaphor here is brought to the fore, as the leader of this branch of the ruling class, Judge Carter, violently penetrates Blanchard by forcing his hand up through his anus and out of his mouth, absorbing him in the process. And that's a sentence I never thought I'd say, but then there's an image I never thought I'd see, so kudos, Yuzna. The film takes LCS's notions of class conflict as sexual exploitation and to the extreme in the now infamous climactic shunting scene. To produce the climax, Yuzna, along with surrealist makeup effects artist Screaming Mad George, was inspired by Salvador Dali.
And I brought two paintings of Dali. One is called Autumn Cannibals, which gives the whole essence of shunting. And another one is the Premonition for Civil War. And this paintings also gives the one of the structures, or like how they transform in the shunting.
And it is hard to deny that there's something strangely artistic about this display of gloopy mounted flesh and body parts. It's, dare I say, beautiful? Don't judge. Chaz Barlin, in his article for Fangoria, described it as unholy couplings, wanton lasciviousness, sexual perversion, and bizarre monsters who were into polymorphous gangbangs. Which is how I describe my Friday nights. The film's presentation of the two great classes that Marx and Engels spoke of reaches its climactic point as the ruling class forcibly penetrates the lower class, feeding on them like a parasite. After Blanchard is finished with, Judge Carter has developed a beauty mark identical to the one he complimented Blanchard on before the shunting, which to me suggests a literal absorption by the upper classes of the lower classes, which, as Engels wrote, exists solely for the purpose of exploiting until the upper class can no longer make use of it. Finished, the society cast away the fleshy waste of Blanchard aside, turning their attention to Bill. And things kinda just spiral from here. Bill rushes upstairs where he finds his parents and sister engaged in a nightmarish three-way. His father takes on the literal manifestation of the insult Bill hurled at him earlier.
Well, son, I guess you're right. I am a butthead.
And then his sister suggests,
If you have any edible fantasies you'd like to indulge in, Billy, now's the time.
it's a lot. There's no pulls, no punches. And the film's descent into full-blown body horror might be one of the purest, most original realizations of the concept I've ever seen.
Hey, Bill.
I love this movie. I don't care what you think. Even in its final moments, though, society continues to utilise elements of melodrama to emphasise its point. Bill turns the shunt against his captors, and in turn penetrates Ferguson, violently pulling his insides out. And this is a visualisation of Marx's ideas that the weapons of the bourgeoisie are turned against the bourgeoisie itself. But while Bill himself succeeds in escaping, the ending is, once again, Circean. Transparently phony and even ominous. Bill may drive off into the sunset with Clarissa in tow, but nothing has truly changed. Yes, Bill has escaped, but now what? Evil still exists. The evil has not been defeated. There's been no grand showdown, no systemic change, no overthrowing of the ruling class. It's I want my revolution, goddammit! As Marx puts it, the real fruit of their battle lies not in the immediate result, but in the ever-expanding union of the workers. Bill is but one person. His success makes little difference to the ruling class. They view it as little more than a mild inconvenience. And that's a depressingly truthful take for a film that so openly delved into the surreal and the absurd, and where everyone's got awful 80s hair. As Bill and Clarissa drive away, the film holds the audience back, the perspective shifting in its final moments. No longer are we aligned with Bill. He's escaped the horror, but we have not. This is the film's final point. It has peeled back the surface to show the audience what lay beneath, but it will not give us the satisfaction of a happy ending. After watching Bill and Clarissa disappear into the distance, driving away from the camera, we return inside the mansion to the aftermath of the shunt. And here we find that the ruling class remain relatively unfazed. As the fleshy, twitching mess of Ferguson lay on the floor, Judge Carter, who had previously offered Ferguson a job in the US Senate, shrugs apathetically and says to the others,
Well, Dr. Cleveland, it looks as though I may have an opening in Washington next summer. Know what I mean?
And this is the note that the film chooses to end on. It then immediately cuts to the credits, accompanied by the Eton Boating song once more. The ruling class remain the ruling class, in control long after the credits roll. Okay, so look, I know what you're thinking, because at this point in writing the script I was basically thinking the same thing. I tend to talk about films through a sort of transgender perspective, and thus far I haven't really mentioned anything all that queer, unless you count Douglas Sirk melodramas as being an especially queer thing, which they are, and you can't prove me wrong. Nonetheless, that is kind of why I set up this channel, and while I don't want to be strictly bound by those rules, I do suspect that my tens of followers kind of expect that kind of thing to come from me. So, is society transgender at all? Well, kinda, but not really.
Hey, let's not waste our time bullshitting.
It's important to note now that we are very much in my own personal reading of the film, so if you don't like that, I don't care. But there is a lot of toying with social norms in society. Firstly, society deals explicitly with body horror, and as we've covered, check out my video on The Fly for more. Body horror can be surmised simply as the manipulation and warping of the normal state of bodily form and function. Now, the normal state here explicitly refers to heteronormative, cis, white, Western ideals of normality, because of course it does. Though society pushes this notion further to include expectations and stereotypes built around family units, class and social behaviours, and sexual taboos. To say that the film focuses on sexual taboos is an understatement. Society really wants to push those taboos, and blur the lines between psychosexual obsessions and fear. The bourgeoisie are shown repeatedly to break these taboos, whether it be same-sex interactions or incestuous involvement. There are countless examples throughout the flick of the upper class going against social norms. And while there is most definitely a problematic aspect to linking same-sex attraction and f***ing incest, it's important to note that heteronormativity in general doesn't really make much of a distinction at all when it comes to otherness. This is interesting in terms of a queer reading of the film because it places Bill almost entirely outside of those around him when it comes to sex and sexual attraction. When Blanchard reveals his tape to Bill, Bill is horrified to hear his sister say,
"Then you can do it with women as well as men." Of course.
Ted kisses Bill at the climax and Bill responds with disgust and horror. Although admittedly everything else about that sequence is also... well, yeah.
I've got to pull myself together.
And then of course there's the shunt itself, which, well, as Mike Munzer from the excellent Evolution of Horror podcast put it,
you know, I mean, yes, it's gross, but also I was kind of like, is this a bit hot at times, this film, you know?
Don't knock it till you tried it, Mike. As Mia Lindenberg writes, Yuzna's both frightening and sexual world created in the film is an incredibly fascinating juxtaposition. In comparison to the rest of his town, Bill is the most straight-laced. And there's an argument to be made that society also plays into the so-called gay panic that spread its way across Western society in the 80s, fueled by conservative politicians, right-wing media campaigns, and the AIDS crisis. To quote Cindy Patton in her piece, AIDS, Lessons from the Gay Community, once the media finally began to report on the crisis, it was almost immediately clear that AIDS hysteria endangered civil liberties and the quest for sexual liberation, whatever that comes to mean. And this is undoubtedly something that the film's kind of playing on. Body horror has often been linked to disease and infection, in part because body horror movies are not simply about bodies, but bodies undergoing change because of disease, age, drugs, medical interference, and other more supernatural causes. It's worth noting Bill's literal disgust and fear of the upper class in society. I mean, of course this is down to their actual monstrous nature in the flick. This is a horror movie. But this certainly does play into social fears of the time. However, in society there's no disease or infection, rather body horror is drawn from the bourgeoisie and their strange bodily contortions and fleshy connections, presented primarily as a sexual act. Of course, this could be seen as even further linking it to AIDS, but personally I think it's something else. The primary purpose of the body horror in society is to serve as perversion. The upper classes pervert heteronormativity, and thus they pervert their own bodies. They twist in impossible ways, they meld together, they mount and contort and mutate. And though they also engage in orgies and incest, doing so displays an openness and sort of nightmarish sexual liberation that only further highlights this supposed perversion from heteronormative ideals. It isn't much of a stretch then to view the bourgeoisie in society as a sort of stand-in for the queer community in general and their perversion of Western heteronormative ideals. Great. Thanks. And when we do this, we kind of start to run into some problems with the representation. I mean, of course we do. This is a horror movie from the 80s. What the f*** were you expecting? Firstly, there's the conflation of sexual liberation and openness with incest and rape. The bourgeoisie in society are coded both as queer and as predators and perverts, and through these simultaneous codings, the film essentially places these things within the same camp. In the world of society, to be queer is to be a predator and pervert. Which is just... that shit. What the f***, Brian? The conflation of queerness and perversion is not a new concept. Early examples of anti-LGBTQ+ propaganda often sees reference to this kind of thinking.
What Jimmy didn't know was that Ralph was sick. A sickness that was not visible like smallpox, but no less dangerous and contagious. A sickness of the mind. You see, Ralph was a homosexual.
And even more recent examples, such as the tendency for so-called gender-critical anti-trans folk to refer to trans people as groomers and paedophiles. According to a report by the Human Rights Campaign and the Centre for Countering Digital Hate, the volume of tweets engaging in grooming discourse increased by 406% in the month following the passage of the Don't Say Gay or Trans bill in Florida. And society just kind of adds fuel to this particular fire. Although, to be fair, we can hardly accuse the film of being alone here. This kind of BS rhetoric has been around for years. I mean, at this point, it's just kind of like, get some new shtick, folks. It's exhausting. Moreover, there's an uncomfortable element that creeps its way in when we view the text through this lens and consider the position that the upper class hold. In society, Bill fills the role of the final girl, and he hits several established final girl tropes. Most notably, he does not have sex throughout the film. Despite his romantic entanglements with both his girlfriend Shauna and Clarissa, not only do we never see him engage in sexual acts, the times that he does come close, he is unable to go through with them. This could be read as queer coding, and along with his final showdown with Ted, there's a lot of evidence to support this reading. In her essay, Her Body Himself, American film scholar Carol J. Clover writes that the so-called final girl specifically unmans an oppressor whose masculinity was in question to begin with. And in society, not only does Bill unman his oppressor, he then penetrates him to kill him. And I don't think I need to go into too much detail on what I think that might mean. In recent years, there's been a rise of conservative and, in part, fundamentalist social movements against the perceived threat of what they call gender ideology, a term that is often used by those movements to position gender egalitarianism, sexual liberation, and LGBTQ+ rights as an attack on traditional values by global elites. It's not hard then to take the presentation of the bourgeoisie in society and see how this particular reading might play into these troubling ideas. As already outlined, society takes a rather angry and aggressive view to the so-called elite, and if the bourgeoisie are also serving as a queer standing, then the representation in Yuzna's film is all the more problematic. Not only does it potentially give credence to hateful and bigoted conspiracy theories, it also does so by linking them with the very real, very relevant issues of wealth inequality and class division. It should go without saying that wealth inequality and class division are very, very real problems, especially here in the UK, but across the rest of the Western world as well. F*** rich people. When there are people struggling to heat their homes, while the rich and wealthy hoard their wealth and waste their time on showboaty cage fights, spreading hateful rhetorics and poisoning social discourse, yes, all of those things were directed at Elon. Give me back my Twitter, Elon, I miss it. It's not particularly helpful to be wasting our time batting off homophobic and transphobic bigotry and nonsensical conspiracy theories that find themselves constantly shoehorned into the more important discussions about the very real problems that damage and hinder the lives and well-being of so many people. But we're getting a little extreme here. Maybe I'm putting too much on this. I mean, God, Lexi, it's just a cheesy 80s movie. No, it's not. It's the key to everything. Because, guys, don't you know, we live in a society. God damn it, mother! I don't think it's quite that simple though. I think we should be looking at this another way. Basically, like, what if we just flip this? It's relatively easy to look toward the monstrous others depicted in the text and apply the deviations of heteronormativity to them. This is, after all, where the literal deviations as depicted in the text lie. But within the realms of society, as is the case out here in reality, the upper classes are not oppressed minorities. Far from it. No, rather it is Bill who stands alone. He is segregated from his friends and family emotionally, psychologically, and physically, and it is this sense of difference from his family and the world around him that drives his motives throughout the plot. And this sense of being different, this feeling of isolation from those around you, is something that I'm pretty sure many LGBTQ+ people can relate to. This isn't just about the sense of isolation, this is about the paranoia. Bill is paranoid. We see this constantly throughout the flick, but his paranoia takes interesting form. It is not necessarily that he believes that his family are different, it's that he believes that he is different from his family. That's confusing. It looked clever in the script, I promise. Let me explain. Bill is the outsider in society. He is the one who's different. He, for lack of a better term, is the other. While the upper classes may be the literal others in the sense that they are literally a different species, throughout the film we meet very, very little actual humans. In fact, other than Bill, the only people we can be certain are members of the elite are Blanchard, who winds up meeting his end, literally, Bill's friend Milo, with whom he and Clarissa escape, and potentially Bill's girlfriend Carmette, Shauna, and also her friend who she sits in the car with.
Oh, I'm so mad I could just scream! Who's that?
I don't know who that person is. I do research, I promise. No one else can be confirmed, and many show up at the end and are revealed to be the elite. So it's not unreasonable to say that Bill is very much in the minority when it comes to society. Feeling different to those closest to you and those around you is very much something that can be read as a queer experience. And while I can only speak from my own personal experiences here, growing up I was very, very much aware of the fact that I just didn't fit in. Bill is socially isolated, and this is something that can and does affect the LGBTQ+ community in many different ways. According to Jonathan Garcia, social isolation describes a lack of a sense of belonging, the inability to engage and connect with others, and the neglect or deterioration of social relationships. What's especially interesting about society here then is the way that it places its audience, specifically the cis white heteronormative audience that identify with Bill, very much in the shoes of the queer experience. Yes, Bill is different physically from his family and those around him, but so too is he different socially. There are key social cues and acts that he is either not invited to be a part of or unable to take part in. His sister's coming out party, which is a concept that in and of itself is weird, is something that he isn't able to join in with and isn't able to understand. When he hears the recording Blanchard gives him of it, he's disgusted. And because of the breaking of social taboos, so too are the audience disgusted. But this places him on the outside, and thus places the audience on the outside. We don't want to, nor are we able to, join in with or find pleasure and enjoyment with them here. At least, I would hope not. But even in the less creepy and gross ways, Bill just doesn't fit in. He doesn't understand their behaviours and their attitudes. He doesn't relate to what they speak about. Indeed, his entire arc in the film is built around his discomfort towards his family and the fact that he doesn't feel a part of it. When writing of the experience of LGBTQ+ young people, Linda Chalmamarian observes, early adolescent years are marked by pervasive self and peer regulation regarding gender and sexuality norms, which can affect the mental well-being of sexual minority youth. And this is key to understanding both Bill's dilemma and the experiences of LGBTQ+ people in general. It's also something that the melodramatic elements, as discussed earlier, could feed into. Bill's entire existence in society is one of an outsider trapped into a world he knows he does not belong. His feelings and identity are questioned. He is told he is one thing when he is unwaveringly and undeniably another. Bill lives a false life, pretending to be something that he himself doesn't even fully understand or know. He plays the part of the enemy, despite being unable to comprehend or identify himself with them. I suspect that I don't need to tell you that this is the experience of many queer people, and of many trans people in particular. Indeed, I myself had to hide my true identity for many, many years before coming out. And it's really, really There are certain things, certain expectations, both social and personal, certain ideas, certain roles, certain categories that you're expected to just kind of fit into, and you can't. You just can't. So what wound up happening with me is that I found that I would mirror other people. I would try and sort of copy their behaviours, try and act in the way that I see them act, because, well, they seem to know what they're doing, so that must mean that that's what I'm supposed to do too. But what this does, this constant sort of comparing yourself to other people, desperately trying to fit into these predetermined roles that you've been told that you're supposed to, is it makes you think that the fault is somehow with you, that your inability to keep up the facade is somehow the problem. And it's not. It's just not. It's this element that Bill really struggles with. Until he finally starts to come to understand the true nature of what is happening to him, Bill is torn between knowing what he feels to be true and what everyone and everything around him forces him to believe is true. When he sees the bodies of the upper class twist and turn in impossible ways, he questions his reality, but is stuck between knowing whether something is wrong with them or something is wrong with him. According to Janet Wiley and Stephen M. Rosenthal, numerous studies, primarily of short-term and medium-term duration, up to 6 years, demonstrate the clearly beneficial, even life-saving, mental health impact of gender-affirming medical care. And it's worth noting here that it isn't until Bill gets affirmation from Clarissa, a member of the bourgeoisie who also feels different and outside of them, that he finally begins to accept his own differences and his role within society. Ultimately, what Bill comes to realise is that it's not he who is wrong, but rather the fault lay within society, and the way it views those who it deems different or less, whether by class, biology, or any other perceived deviation of the norm. And that, well, that's a message that I think is worth remembering. Alright, so what exactly have we learned here? The film draws on the excessive style of 80s cinema and television to create a world that is once instantly recognisable and yet noticeably false. Using stereotypical melodramatic and soap opera trappings, Yuzna highlights the falseness and fakeness of the upper class, Beverly Hills-based socialites that the film aims its sights at. You see, Bill's awareness that something is wrong is only heightened by the film's televisual style. The bright lighting and excessively good-looking young cast who hang out on the beaches and go to house parties all serve to fit into a cliched soapy fashion. This seemingly idealised version of reality is then carefully stripped back, the rotted, maggot-infested core of the apple, as it were. Again, the film really isn't subtle, with the use of unsettlingly creepy and mesmerisingly inventive moments of body horror. And the film sits alongside John Carpenter's The Thing or David Cronenberg's The Fly as one of the best examples of cinema's weirdly wonderful and frighteningly gloopy offerings. Starting small and then beginning to grow, the film kinda progresses from here. Each moment becomes more outlandish and bizarre than the last, until finally we get to the climax, which, well, yeah. Inevitably, however, the over-top, overtly 80s daytime drama-esque approach is destined to put some people off, and the film does take its time building the suspense, even at a slick 100 minutes. So if you're not willing to put up with the purposefully hammy performances and glossy sunlit settings, then it's fair to say that Society probably isn't going to be for you. However, if you are able and willing to buy into the movie's glossy, weird, silly tone, then you're in for a treat. It's a film that leaves you with your mouth agape, shocked that yes, they really did go there, and just who the hell would have dreamt up this kind of gross, shocking, horrific thing to begin with. But the most important facet of Society, stripping away the incredibly impressive effects work, the hilariously exaggerated soap opera tone, the wonderfully hammy performances, and the humorous little jokes, is that ultimately the concept at its core is both depressingly timeless and properly frightening. Society is by no means a scary film. It's a fun one, designed to be a good time, and I doubt anyone's actually watched it and ever been truly scared. But it is hard to deny that the ideas at its core, the themes that it explores, are inherently terrifying. Perhaps scarier still is the fact that all these years later, those ideas are still relevant and as scary and contemporary as ever. And I mean, look, they're still making movies about it. I mean, none as wild or crazy as Society, but still. It's a film that is both wonderfully 80s and unsettlingly contemporary, and it is well worth some kind of rediscovery or reappraisal. The thing that makes Society worth remembering, more than anything else though, is its refusal to back down from its ideas or compromise on what it wants to say. Society is an angry film, one that violently strips back the artifice of the then contemporary media landscape to highlight its capitalist core, a core that exists solely for the benefit of a vicious, selfish ruling class to exploit those deemed beneath them. And what makes that such a powerful point is that, well, nothing has really changed. Even now, here in our world, we're fed trashy, shiny schlock that glorifies greed and attempts to brainwash us into submission while putting the rich and wealthy on a pedestal. But as Society shows us, the popcorn-coated, pleasantly appealing exterior isn't the truth. From major corporations hiding behind beloved childhood icons to obscure shady business practices, yes, I got another Disney dig in. What the f*** do you want from me? To politicians and has-been children's authors shamelessly exploiting so-called infotainment and the 24-hour news cycle to both mask their true motives and spread their harmful rhetoric, it's all the same damaging, unequal wrapped up in a different type of glitter. And society wants us to recognise that fact. A film that stays with you long after the credits roll, Society belongs in a class, I thank you, all of its own. Flawed yet masterful, rough around the edges yet expertly crafted, outdated and yet modern. You should watch it. Why aren't you watching it? Go and f***ing watch it! Hey folks! Ooh, that was a lot, wasn't it? This one took a while to put together. I drew from a couple of pieces I'd written previously and added some extra bits and new observations in. I really do recommend Society though, so if you haven't seen it and for some reason have watched this till the end, please go and seek it out. It deserves way more love. Anyway, if you've enjoyed this video and you want to see more, please consider supporting me either via Patreon, where you can access extra writings and get your name in the credits here, or as a one-off on Ko-fi, if a subscription ain't your thing. Of course, you can also like and subscribe to the channel, and share the vids around, that's more than enough, as is just watching. Thank you so much for all your support, and I'll see you again real soon.